On the morning of November 18, 1987, deputies stepped inside the Dardeen family's trailer and were met with a scene so horrifying that even veteran officers would never forget it. Ruby Elaine Dardeen, her 3-year-old son Peter, and a baby girl who had just been born had all been brutally murdered inside the home. But one family member was missing. Keith Dardeen, Elaine's husband and the children's father, was nowhere to be found. His car was missing too, so at first, police thought they'd already figured out what had happened. They believed Keith had killed his family and fled. That theory fell apart the very next day. Keith's body was found, and it was obvious he had been murdered too. With that discovery, the entire case changed overnight. Investigators had no clear motive, no viable suspect, and no explanation for who could have wiped out an entire family with that kind of brutality. It all happened in the tiny town of Ina, Illinois, a place with little more than a handful of businesses and a gas station. Before this, nobody imagined something like this could ever happen there. Before we dive into the case, I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a second to like the video. It goes a long way in supporting the time and effort that goes into making videos like this. Now, let's go back to 1986. That year, Russell Keith Dardeen completed his training to become a water treatment plant operator. Keith was originally from Mount Carmel, Illinois. After finishing the program, he bought a mobile home and moved to Ina so he could be closer to work. Not long after, his wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, joined him from Albion with their 2-year-old son, Peter. The family rented a lot near Illinois Route 37 from a local farming couple, just a short drive from Keith's workplace, while Elaine worked at a stationery store in nearby Mount Vernon. Keith and Elaine were both deeply religious and rarely missed church. Whenever they weren't at work, they volunteered with the music ministry at their local Baptist church. Keith sang in the choir, while Elaine played the piano. In 1987, Elaine became pregnant with their second child. They'd already picked out names. If the baby was a boy, they'd name him Ian. If it was a girl, she'd be called Casey. As Elaine's due date got closer, Keith put their trailer up for sale. He'd made up his mind. It was time to move his family somewhere safer. The area had been getting more violent, and the Dardeens no longer felt comfortable living there. In just 2 years, Jefferson County had seen 15 murders. As crime continued to rise, Keith became increasingly protective of his family. On one occasion, he even refused to let a young woman inside after she asked to use their phone. Years later, Keith's mother said he'd been planning to move the family back to their old hometown. Then came November 18, 1987. Keith never showed up for work, and he hadn't called to say he wouldn't be coming in. That wasn't like him at all. He had a reputation for being dependable, so when he didn't show up, his supervisor immediately felt that something was wrong. He tried calling Keith's house several times, but no one answered. He then called Keith's parents, but they hadn't seen him either. Keith's parents tried calling the house themselves, but still no answer. By then, they were worried too. Keith's father, Don Dardeen, contacted the sheriff's office and agreed to meet deputies at the trailer in Ina, bringing a spare key with him. When they arrived at the trailer, they knocked several times, but no one answered. Eventually, they used the spare key to get inside. What they found was horrific. Elaine and Peter had been tied up, their mouths sealed with duct tape, and then beaten to death with a baseball bat. The bat was still lying at the scene. It was the same one Keith had bought for Peter as a birthday present earlier that year. Elaine had been beaten so severely that she went into labor nearly 2 months early and gave birth to a baby girl. But whoever was responsible showed no mercy. The newborn was beaten to death as well. Elaine had suffered a devastating blow to the upper right side of her head that fractured her skull. Peter's body was covered in cuts and bruises, and his skull had also been crushed. Keith's red 1981 Plymouth was missing, which is why investigators initially believed he'd snapped, murdered his family, and driven off. But the people who knew Keith best couldn't believe that for a second. His friends and family insisted he would never hurt his wife or children. A search team was organized almost immediately, but it didn't take long. A group of hunters found Keith's body in a wheat field about a mile from his home. He'd been shot 3 times, once in the forehead, once on the right side of his face, and once in his left cheek. His genitals had also been mutilated. Keith's car was later found near the police station in Benton, about 12 miles from his home. The inside was covered in blood, leading investigators to believe he'd most likely been killed inside the vehicle. The autopsy later showed that Keith had probably been murdered about 2 hours after the rest of his family. The murders sent shockwaves through the area. Many residents bought guns for protection and started carrying them almost everywhere they went. Before this, people often left their doors unlocked. Afterward, they found themselves checking the locks twice before going to bed. The sheriff of neighboring Franklin County later said people had become so terrified of letting strangers into their homes that if someone's car broke down or ran out of gas on a rural road, they were better off walking to the nearest highway or trying to flag down a passing driver than knocking on a stranger's door. As the investigation got underway, detectives interviewed more than 100 people, but they quickly hit a dead end. No one could figure out what the motive could have been. Everyone who knew the Dardeens spoke highly of them. The trailer showed no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no smashed windows. The only unusual thing was that the back door had been left open. A VCR, a video camera, cash, and jewelry were all sitting out in plain sight, yet none of it had been taken. Investigators also found evidence that the killer or killers had actually tried to clean up the crime scene before leaving, suggesting they hadn't been in any hurry to get out. Elaine had not been sexually assaulted, and detectives found no evidence that either she or Keith had been involved in an affair that might explain the murders. A small amount of marijuana was found inside the trailer, but it wasn't nearly enough to suggest the Dardeens had anything to do with drug trafficking. Investigators even considered the possibility that the marijuana hadn't belonged to the family at all and may have been left behind by the killer. The Dardeens weren't drowning in debt, and as far as anyone knew, they didn't have enemies. No one could think of a reason why anyone would want to hurt them. Investigators did find a stack of sports betting sheets inside the trailer, and for a while they wondered if Keith had been gambling and gotten himself into serious debt. But that theory didn't hold up for long and was eventually ruled out. The murders were so brutal that some locals became convinced a satanic cult had to be behind them. But investigators quickly dismissed that idea. According to detectives familiar with ritualistic crimes, cult-related murders often involve specific forms of mutilation, along with symbols, candles, or other ritualistic items left at the scene. None of that was found inside the Dardeens' home. What police did believe was that this family hadn't been chosen at random. The level of violence suggested something deeply personal. Keith's mother, Joanne, later said, "I think someone wanted Keith to sell drugs for them, but he refused." The sheriff had another theory. It's possible someone became interested in Elaine. She turned him down, and he took his anger out on both of them. The truth is, we just don't know. With so few leads to work with, the investigation slowly began to go cold. But Joanne refused to let people forget what had happened to her son's family. Throughout the 1990s, she stayed in constant contact with investigators. Sometimes she'd pass along tips she'd uncovered herself. Other times she'd simply call to ask whether there had been any progress in the case. She even managed to collect more than 3,000 signatures from local residents, hoping to convince the Oprah Winfrey Show to feature the case. But the producers turned her down, saying the murders were simply too graphic for a daytime television audience. At first, America's Most Wanted also declined to cover the case. Eventually, though, the show aired a segment about the murders in 1998. Even then, no meaningful new leads came in. Over the years, several possible suspects were considered. In 1999, a man named Tommy Linsells was arrested near Del Rio, Texas, after attacking 2 young girls by slashing their throats. One of the girls survived and was able to identify him. Sells was convicted of that attack, along with another murder he'd committed earlier that same year, and was sentenced to death. Once he was in prison, he gradually began confessing to dozens of other murders that he claimed he'd committed while hitchhiking and traveling across the country. One of the cases he claimed responsibility for was the murder of the Dardeen family. In 2010, Sells claimed that back in November 1987, while traveling through Jefferson County, he'd run into Keith at a truck stop. According to Sells, Keith invited him home for dinner. He then claimed that after the meal, Keith suggested having a threesome with him and Elaine. Sells said the proposition sent him into a blind rage, causing him to lose control and murder the entire family. But neither Keith's family, his friends, nor investigators believed the story. Keith had always been extremely protective of his family. In fact, there had been a time when he refused to let a young woman into the house just to use the phone. Because of that, the idea that he'd invite a complete stranger home for dinner seemed highly unlikely. Sells was questioned over and over again, and with each interview, his story kept changing. Some of the details he gave matched information that had already been reported in the media. But whenever investigators asked him about facts that had never been made public, his answers were filled with contradictions and outright mistakes. At first, Joan believed Sells might really be the man who killed her son's family. But after hearing his account for herself in 2000, she no longer believed him. As time went on, she became more and more convinced that Sells had nothing to do with the murders. Over the years, Sells confessed to more than 70 killings. Investigators, however, were only able to link him to 22 of them, and the Dardeen family murders were not among those cases. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed in 2014. More than 40 years have now passed since the brutal murders of the Dardeen family, yet investigators still don't know what the motive was or who was truly responsible. The case remains open, and to this day, it has never been solved.